Hi, welcome my channel. This is Isabelle's story, betrayed, underestimated, but never broken. She lost everything, then took it all back. Let's dive in. Isabelle Laurent had spent the better part of a decade building a life she thought was rooted in partnership, only to watch it collapse in a marble-floored foyer under the flicker of a Murano chandelier. The room was cold, but Hugo Sinclair's voice was colder. It's time you moved on. Isabelle, he said, swirling aged scotch in a crystal tumbler as if discussing the weather. Her gaze fell to the row of Louis Vuitton suitcases lined neatly by the door, her Christmas gift from 2 years ago, now repurposed to carry her out of the very home she helped design. Your things are already packed, Hugo added, his tone calm, practiced. Isabelle's heart pounded, but her voice was steady. After 8 years, you're just discarding me? His smirk was effortless, polished. Don't be dramatic. We both know the marriage served its purpose. Your inheritance helped Maison Étoile become what it is. Now that we're about to expand into Paris and Tokyo, I need someone more fitting by my side. Isabelle didn't need to ask who. Dahlia Shaw, young, ambitious, and the brand's new head of digital strategy, had been in too many private meetings lately. Her presence lingering like a perfume Hugo never quite washed off. The glances during press events, the late nights masked as crisis briefings, they all made sense now. Melissa understands vision, Hugo said, obliviously inserting the wrong name and revealing just how interchangeable his muses were. She speaks the language of global tech. You were perfect for the startup phase. But this is evolution. Isabelle looked around at the penthouse she had restored with her own eye for art and history, the staircase they had once danced on after their first anniversary, the fireplace where Hugo had proposed. So, what do I get? A farewell and a brand you built on my legacy? He offered a shrug. You'll get whatever the prenuptial allows, which, as I recall, isn't much. But Isabelle didn't flinch, not outwardly, because what Hugo didn't know, what his arrogance blinded him from suspecting, was that she had spent the last year preparing for this moment. Watching, documenting, planning. Good luck with the board meeting tomorrow, she said, rolling her suitcase toward the door. I'm sure it'll be illuminating. Hugo's brow twitched just slightly. And Isabelle caught it, the first flicker of uncertainty. She stepped into the elevator, heels clicking, spine straight, and as the doors slid closed, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. He thought he was ending the story. But really, he had just set the next chapter in motion. The hotel suite at the Langham was quiet, the city humming faintly beyond the glass as Isabelle Laurent opened her laptop and logged into the encrypted file directory she'd been maintaining in secret for months. The screen lit up with years of correspondence, legal documents, investor contracts, board memos, meticulously catalogued and timestamped. Each one was a breadcrumb in a trail that led back to one inescapable truth. Maison Étoile was not Hugo Sinclair's empire alone. It was born from Isabelle's inheritance, her connections, and her vision. While Hugo had dazzled the fashion world with interviews and runway spotlights, Isabelle had secured the early funding, managed investor relations, and served as silent creative director on half the brand's formative collections. The narrative he spun, of a self-made fashion mogul with genius in his veins, was a fabrication polished with press releases and editorial features. And now, with the board's expansion vote looming, it was time for the real story to surface. The most damning files weren't just about money, they were about deception. Isabelle had uncovered proof that Hugo and Dahlia had begun shifting intellectual property, design sketches, fabric sourcing contracts, and even entire campaign concepts, into a shell company registered discreetly in Luxembourg. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a hostile takeover. And they thought she wouldn't notice. That she'd quietly disappear, heartbroken and forgotten. A footnote in a founder's origin myth. But Isabelle had learned from the best, her late Aunt Vivienne, the fiercely shrewd founder of a legacy couture house, had once told her, "Darling, in business, the sharpest stilettos are made of paper. Contracts, ownership, names." Isabelle had listened. She had insisted on being listed as a founding partner in the earliest documentation, had retained her voting shares, and, most crucially, had secured an undisclosed clause in the brand charter requiring full founder consent before any international expansion. Hugo might have erased her from the media narrative, but not from the books. That night, she drafted a formal memo to the board, attaching select documents as a preview. In the interest of transparency, she wrote, "I believe Maison Étoile deserves to know its full origin before approving expansion." She hit send, heart steady. The world thought she was just the discarded wife of a rising fashion icon. But by morning, they'd see her for who she really was, the architect of everything Hugo had built. The air inside the Maison Étoile boardroom crackled with anticipation. Nestled atop a sleek glass building in Mayfair, the room was a curated expression of the brand: white marble table, velvet chairs in soft dove gray, and fresh peonies arranged in tall crystal vases. Outside, London rain tapped rhythmically against the windows. But inside, the only storm brewing was between two opposing forces: Isabelle Laurent, the quietly exiled co-founder, and Hugo Sinclair, the golden-faced CEO whose star was on the verge of imploding. Isabelle entered the room dressed with quiet precision, a tailored navy sheath dress, her signature pearl studs, and a calmness that unnerved the board more than any outburst ever could. She walked to the far end of the table and placed her laptop on the polished surface without a word. Hugo, seated at the head beside Dahlia Shaw, arched an eyebrow and leaned back, his expression the perfect mix of condescension and irritation. "Isabelle," he said smoothly, "I believe this meeting was scheduled to vote on expansion, not personal grievances." "Indeed," she replied, connecting her laptop to the room's projector. "Which is why I believe the board deserves a complete picture before making such a decision." The screen behind her flickered to life, displaying the original founding documents of Maison Étoile, contracts bearing her signature, bank transfers from her personal accounts, and a clause circled in red: "All strategic expansions must receive written approval from both co-founders." A hush fell over the room. Maison Étoile, Isabelle began, her voice steady, was founded on more than just creativity. It was built with trust, with transparency, and unfortunately, with deception. She clicked again. Images of design files appeared, ones she had created, but which had recently been submitted under Dahlia's name in internal memos. Then came emails between Hugo and foreign investors, proof of attempts to dilute her shares and reroute assets into a Luxembourg-based holding company. The board members leaned forward, whispering. Lord Edwin Blackstone, the chairman, removed his glasses and looked at Hugo. "Is this accurate?" Hugo's face tensed. "This is a personal vendetta," he snapped. "She's twisting legal language. The company has evolved." "Evolved?" Isabelle cut in, her eyes locked on his. "Or been hijacked?" Before he could respond, Priya Kapoor, the company's general counsel, cleared her throat. "I've reviewed these documents. If accurate, they constitute not only a breach of fiduciary duty but potential fraud. I recommend pausing the expansion vote until a full investigation is conducted." Dahlia turned pale. The boardroom fell into stunned silence. Then Lord Blackstone spoke again. Effective immediately. "I'm calling for an executive session. Hugo, Dahlia, please step outside." As the doors closed behind them, Isabelle remained seated. She wasn't triumphant. Not yet. But the war for Maison Étoile had begun, and the truth had just torn the first seam in Hugo's carefully tailored empire. Before the boardroom battles and legal maneuvering, before betrayal carved its name across her heart, there was only the dream, a vision woven between midnight sketches and whispered promises. Isabelle Laurent had been just 26 when she stood in the crumbling loft that would one day become Maison Étoile's first atelier. Dust danced in the sunbeams. The air smelled of old velvet and wood polish. And beside her stood Hugo Sinclair, wide-eyed, passionate, and, back then, honest. He'd called her a genius. Told her that her illustrations were more than fashion, they were prophecy. They'd toast with cheap champagne after long nights, building mood boards from scraps and ambition. He was the voice in the investor meetings, the charming closer. She was the soul of the designs, her lines breathing elegance into every hemline and collar. They didn't have much, but Isabelle had something most young designers only dreamed of, a modest inheritance from her grandmother. And a willingness to risk it all. She poured nearly £500 into Hugo's business plan, co-signing the lease, sourcing fabric, even paying their first employees. At the time, it hadn't mattered whose name was on what. "It's ours," Hugo used to say. "You and me, co-founders, forever." She believed him. The turning point had been the Paris showcase. One perfect evening where Maison Étoile stunned the fashion world with its debut collection, structured silhouettes that whispered of old Hollywood. Subtle embroidery inspired by moonlit gardens. And a finale dress that left the audience breathless. Journalists called it the rebirth of European couture. Orders flooded in. Investors followed. And with success came the shift. Hugo started taking more solo meetings. Brushing off her input. Dahlia arrived soon after. Young and silver-tongued, whispering, scalability, and streamlining creative direction. Slowly, Isabelle was pushed aside, told to focus on inspiration, while the real decisions happened behind closed doors. But she remembered everything, every contract, every check, every fabric sample she sourced by hand. The dream might have been built together, but it had always been hers first. And now, as the facade of Maison Étoile began to crack, that past, her truth, was finally stepping out from behind the curtain. Ready to reclaim what had always belonged to her. The days following the boardroom confrontation were a frenzy of damage control. But Isabelle Laurent moved through it all with a calm sharpened by betrayal. While Hugo scrambled to salvage investor trust and Dahlia Shaw vanished behind carefully worded PR statements, Isabelle turned inward, diving deep into the archives of Maison Étoile. Both digital and personal. What she found was worse than she imagined. The designs she'd sketched by candlelight, labeled early drafts, had been refiled under Hugo's name. Emails she'd sent with sourcing leads, budget breakdowns, and production timelines had been deleted or redirected to a dummy folder she never knew existed. Dahlia, it turned out, had meticulously curated a narrative, Isabelle as a troubled creative. Hugo as the savior who'd refined her chaos into couture. It was an erasure in real time. And it had been happening for years. But what Hugo hadn't counted on was Isabelle's tendency to keep copies physical. Timestamped, hand-labeled files in her private studio. She unearthed journals with original sketches, annotated mood boards, signed vendor contracts with her initials in the margins. More damning still were voice memos from their early planning sessions, Hugo's voice giddy with ideas, explicitly crediting her for the Maison's aesthetic. And then there was the paper trail, the original partnership agreement her late grandmother's solicitor had quietly insisted on. Signed and notarized, tucked in a folder marked, just in case. Just in case. Those 3 words hit her harder than any betrayal. As if even her grandmother had sensed the storm that might one day come. With this arsenal, Isabelle didn't just have proof, she had the power to rewrite the narrative. Maison Étoile had tried to paint her as a muse who had faded. But she wasn't done. She wasn't broken. Behind the curtain of Hugo's polished press releases and Dahlia's strategic misdirections lay a different truth. That the soul of the brand had always belonged to her. And now, the world would know. The board reconvened under heavy tension. The scent of scandal still clinging to the air. This time, Isabelle Laurent walked in not as the ousted creative, but as a woman armed with receipts, resilience, and the weight of truth. She wore one of her original designs, an unspoken reminder that her fingerprints were all over the DNA of Maison Étoile. Hugo Sinclair sat stiffly at the head of the table, flanked by Dahlia Shaw and a visibly uncomfortable Lord Blackstone. Before anyone could speak, Isabelle placed a thick dossier in front of each board member, followed by a sleek tablet loaded with digital files. "Before we discuss the future," she said calmly, "let's correct the past." As pages turned and screens flickered to life, the room shifted. There were contracts with her name, timestamps of early-stage design files, licensing documents that proved her exclusive rights to signature textile patterns, proof that Maison Étoile had not only been her vision, but her legal property in more ways than anyone had known. The pièce de résistance was an audio clip, Hugo's voice, effusive and unfiltered from years ago, praising her genius and admitting he would be nowhere without her eye. The silence that followed was brutal. Isabelle stood her ground. Maison Étoile was built with my inheritance, my designs, my blood. she said, and yet I was cut out, lied to, and nearly erased. Hugo attempted to recover, suggesting it had been a misunderstanding of roles. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Dahlia stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then Lord Blackstone cleared his throat. Miss Laurent, he said with uncharacteristic softness. What would you have us do? She didn't hesitate. I want Hugo and Dahlia removed from executive roles effective immediately. I want full creative control reinstated under my name. And I want Maison Étoile's story corrected, in every public channel. A beat of silence followed. Then, slowly, one by one, the board nodded. The vote was unanimous. Just like that, the tide turned. As Hugo stormed out, defeated and exposed, Isabelle felt a strange calm settle in. It wasn't vengeance that filled her, it was reclamation. She hadn't come to burn the house down. She'd come to rebuild it, this time. On her own terms. Within hours of the board's decision, the news broke, and the fashion world erupted. Laurent reclaims Étoile. Founder ousts CEO in stunning turnaround. Blared Vogue's online edition. Fashion Wire posted exclusive audio of Hugo Sinclair's damning praise from the early years. While Style Critic ran a scathing exposé on Dahlia Shaw's role in the deception. Reporters camped outside Maison Étoile's Paris headquarters, jostling for a glimpse of Isabelle Laurent, the once erased founder now restored to power. For weeks, social media buzzed with hashtags like #Justice for Laurent and #RealVisionary. Designers, stylists, and fashion bloggers rushed to Isabelle's defense, many sharing memories of her early sketches and runway breakthroughs long buried under Sinclair's branding. Though the spotlight blazed hot, Isabelle remained composed. Her public statement was brief but commanding. Maison Étoile was founded on a vision of authenticity, creativity, and integrity. It's time to return to those values. The statement went viral, resonating far beyond the world of high fashion. Interviews followed, from CNN to French Vogue, but Isabelle carefully controlled the narrative. She spoke not of betrayal, but of rebirth. This isn't a scandal, she told one journalist. It's a correction. Inside the walls of Étoile. However, the fallout was intense. Hugo vanished from the public eye, his PR team scrambling to contain the damage. Dahlia issued a carefully worded apology, citing misaligned ambitions. Lord Blackstone remained quiet, but insiders whispered that he'd privately apologized to Isabelle, acknowledging her rightful place at the helm. The staff, once walking on eggshells, now buzzed with hope. It feels like the soul of Étoile is coming back. One junior designer posted anonymously on an industry forum. And at the center of the storm, Isabelle didn't flinch. She had weathered exile, erasure, and public dismissal, but now, she stood in the full glare of recognition. The world had finally caught up with the truth she never stopped believing in. In the months following the boardroom coup, Isabelle Laurent didn't just reclaim her title, she began the painstaking process of rebuilding Maison Étoile from the inside out. She didn't arrive with grand pronouncements or sweeping changes. Instead, she walked the halls quietly, sat beside junior designers during fittings, and listened, really listened. The atmosphere shifted, subtly at first. The tension that once haunted the atelier was replaced with something gentler, an undercurrent of hope. She remembers our names, one intern whispered to another. She actually asks what we think. Isabelle's leadership style wasn't built on fear or control. It was built on trust. She restructured the company's hierarchy, dissolving the intimidating top-down chain of command Hugo had enforced, and instead created creative circles, collaborative hubs where ideas could flow freely between design, production, and marketing. For the first time in years, the team felt like a team. Sketches were met with encouragement, not dismissal. Mistakes were learning moments, not liabilities. But it wasn't all smooth. The brand was still under scrutiny, and many in the industry waited to see if Isabelle could truly turn Étoile around. She didn't rush to release a new collection. Instead, she returned to her roots. Every morning, she'd arrive early, set up in a quiet corner of the studio, and sketch. Some days, she sewed small details by hand, remembering the feel of thread through fabric, the grounding simplicity of creation. She invited others to join her, apprentices, former assistants, even overlooked interns. They stitched together not just garments, but a new culture. Her first collection back as creative director was titled Resurgence. It wasn't flashy, it was intentional. Every piece told a story of endurance, craftsmanship, and authenticity. When it debuted, critics wept, not for its extravagance, but for its soul. One reviewer wrote, "It's as though Aitwal remembered who she was." And Isabelle? She wasn't chasing redemption anymore. She was stitching her legacy one seam, one design, one honest step at a time. The final thread came not with a headline or a board vote, but in a quiet, unexpected moment that stitched everything together. It was the morning of the fall retrospective, a special exhibit honoring Maison Aitwal's decades of design. Isabelle Laurent had been asked to speak, to reflect on the brand's past, present, and future. As she stood in the private archive room, surrounded by dresses she'd once sketched as a hopeful 20-something, she spotted it, a forgotten gown tucked into a corner. Unfinished, cream silk, hand-stitched embroidery, faded by time. Her mother's last design before she passed the company to Isabelle. Isabelle pulled the gown from its dust cover, her fingers trembling slightly. It was flawed. Yes, an uneven hem, a missing cuff, but it was honest, raw, emotional, a relic of a time when fashion was about feeling, not just market strategy. She stared at the loose threads, suddenly overwhelmed by all that had been lost and reclaimed. Her mother's legacy, her own identity, the soul of Aitwal. That afternoon, instead of delivering a formal speech, Isabelle unveiled the finished gown on the runway, repaired, reimagined, but true to its original spirit. As the lights dimmed and the model stepped into the spotlight, the room fell silent. No flashy music, no spectacle, just the weight of history meeting the breath of renewal. When the model reached the end of the runway, Isabelle joined her, standing beside the dress that symbolized it all. "This," she said softly into the microphone, "is where we began, and where we begin again." Applause erupted, not thunderous, but respectful, reverent, because everyone in that room, from journalists to seamstresses, knew they were witnessing something rare, a woman reclaiming her story with grace, not vengeance. Later that night, back in her office, Isabelle stood at the window overlooking Paris. The city pulsed below, vibrant and restless. She poured herself a glass of wine, removed the day's makeup, and let the silence settle in. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had something to prove. Maison Aitwal was hers again, not just in name, but in heart. The story of Isabelle Laurent teaches us that true power lies not in titles or public praise, but in reclaiming your voice when others try to silence it. Betrayed by those closest to her, Isabelle chose not retaliation, but restoration, of her name, her legacy, and her family's vision. Through quiet resilience and unwavering integrity, she exposed lies, rebuilt trust, and redefined leadership on her own terms. Her journey reminds us that legacy isn't something you're given, it's something you fight for. Stitch by stitch, truth by truth, and sometimes, the boldest act is simply standing back up with grace.